that you've had a productive time so far. It sounds like you have. So what I want to do today is dig in a little deeper into the Douglas text, into Douglas's life. I don't regret having spent all the time that we did talking about issues of the present. There's actually a line in Douglas' speech where he says, we have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. And I think it's in that spirit that the past really only concerns us to the extent that it can illuminate the present. And there is something that sometimes people call presentism, which is a bad way of teaching history, where you teach history only in terms and as a function of contemporary concerns. And that's obviously, I think, to be avoided. The preoccupations and issues that concern us may not have been the same ones that concern the past, and to try to impose that on the past is, I think, an analytical error. Yet, having said that, it doesn't negate the fact that the past only interests us, is only relevant, and is only assimilatable as a way to have a deeper understanding of the present, as a way to illuminate, to shed light on, to clarify the present. So I don't at all regret having spent time thinking about the situation, in particular because, as we said, it is a historically significant moment. We are in a historic moment. I think that it's true. We are in a historic moment as far as the issue of race and racism. And one way to put that is that you can think of the abolitionist movement as organized around ending one particular form of egregious legal racial subjugation, namely slavery. Slavery is ended with the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. First, it's dealt a mortal blow with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then it's formally ended with the constitutional amendment. And then it becomes immediately obvious that the problem of inequality and exploitation is far from over, that emancipation is only the beginning of it. And then you begin a period of activism and organization around civil rights, about bringing the laws into alignment with the ideal of equality. That effort is dealt a tremendous blow in 1898 with the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision, as you all probably know, enshrines the principle of separate but equal. That is, it gives a carte blanche to the Jim Crow South, or would become the Jim Crow South, to legislate for blacks and for whites, to have two sets of laws, one of which applies to whites and one of which applies to blacks. And then, of course, there's a long fight against that, and that is finally overthrown. That specific case of Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned in 1954 with the Brown versus Waterbed decision. And even then, the Brown versus Waterbed decision in 54 talks about dismantling legal segregation. The phrase they use is with all deliberate speed. By the mid-60s, 10 years later, civil rights leaders have had it and see that this all deliberate speed is going nowhere, and begin to agitate for a civil rights bill and a set of measures that would get the federal government in there enforcing these norms of equality. Okay, so you can think of that the civil rights movement as achieving a kind of legal equality. I think the civil rights movement achieves a kind of legally leveled ground overwhelmingly. We see that legally level ground still did not address a legacy of disadvantage. That when people run on a leveled field, a race in a level field, if you start behind, or if you start with a broken ankle or crutches or something, it's still not the legacy of inequality prevents the equal application of race-neutral laws. Okay, so that gets me to, I think, where we are now, which is a recognition, a mass recognition that legal equality is not enough. That is, that there are ways in which the legacy of slavery and racism infiltrates our institutions, that apply race-neutral laws, cultures, corporate cultures, professional cultures, culture in general, that excludes and perpetuates forms of racial inequality. That is a much more subtle problem and a much more difficult problem to tackle. You can't just pass a law to end racism. You can't just change policies that will uproot systemic racism, because ultimately the systemic racism we see in our society is not rooted in the legal framework. It's rooted in people's consciousness. It's rooted in people's perspectives, in people's paradigms. But anyway, the historical, I think, significant moment in which we are is a much wider, a qualitatively wider recognition of that in our society. How we will respond, what we will do, I think both remains to be seen, but also remains to be determined by us. What we will do, how we will respond is up to us. I think that part of the way that we can respond educationally is by, through texts like this, continuing that work, deepening that work of a change in consciousness, a change in framework, a deeper understanding of the reality of racial discrimination and systemic racial discrimination, and a recognition of its roots, of its historical development. I want to pick up where I left off, kind of in the story of Douglass, and there's a lot that I want to say today. There's a lot that I wanted to say on Monday. Not going to be able to get through everything I want to say, but I say as a warning that I have more to say than I can say. As a warning that if left to my own devices, I could just speak for an hour and a half and not let anybody say a word, and that would be a loss. And a lost opportunity for all of us. So please don't let me. Please raise your hands, unmute yourselves, and come in with questions, with comments, with observations. So I even if I don't pause to solicit them, I implore you to please come in with questions, observations, comments. But to pick it up where we left kind of Douglas's story. So Douglas escapes from slavery when he's 20. He had a previous attempt to escape. He had actually, from a plantation in Maryland, but deep in the country, he hatched a plot with a couple of very close friends to take off one day. Their plan was to steal a small boat or a canoe and sail up the river, and kind of what what would happen if they made it into free territory, it was unclear. And actually, in retrospect, Douglas counts it as a fortune that that plot was discovered. That plot is unearthed. One of the five, I think it's five conspirators, as it were, snitches, and the plot is discovered the morning that they're going to execute it. They come in and are arrested. And Douglas, one of the kind of incredible lucky breaks is that Douglas fully expects that what's going to happen to him is that he will be sold downriver. That's an expression that just kind of sends chills up the spine of any slave, but to be sold deeper into the South, where conditions were more brutal, and where the prospect of escape was essentially nil. That's what Douglas expects is going to happen to him, and that's what his owner said is going to do to him. But somehow, and this is, I think Douglas probably saw the hand of Providence in this. For some reason, his owner decides not to do that. And instead of selling him south, he sends him back to Baltimore to his brother, where he had been as a child and where he was when we read that passage about the acquisition of literacy. An extraordinary lucky break for Douglas. He goes to Baltimore, and in Baltimore, as an adult, gains a fair bit of autonomy. He strikes a deal with his master where he works in the shipyards and just gives his master his weekly wages. But any money he can make on top of his weekly wages, he can keep for himself. So if he can pick up odd jobs, etc. So that's not an unprecedented arrangement in a city like Baltimore, which is a commercial center and where the slavery was not a prevalent institution. There was a community of slaves and free blacks that interacted freely. In this community of free blacks and slaves, Douglas meets his person who would become his wife, Anna. Anna is a free black woman who works as a household servant. And Douglas, it's from Baltimore that Douglas, with Anna's help, makes arrangements to escape. He borrows the papers of a free black man, a sailor, and with those papers travels undisturbed, although there are some harrowing close calls, travels undisturbed by train and boat to New York. It's an exhilarating, crazy scene when Douglas arrives in the New York Bay, in a scene that kind of recalls many kind of immigrant scenes of arriving kind of in the Lower East Side, coming into Liberty Island and finding yourself in the middle of the bustle and hustle of Manhattan, not knowing what has hit you. That happens with Douglas. It's a very scene reminiscent of that. And Douglas, from New York, soon writes a letter back to Anna, saying he's made it. He's safe. And Anna immediately then makes the exact same journey he made, on the exact same trains, the exact same ships and routes. She's free. So she makes a journey to New York, meets him. They immediately get married. Douglas, whose slave name was Frederick Bailey, adopts the name Frederick Douglass. Douglas adopts the name Douglas from a poem by Walter Scott, Lady of the Lake, in which Douglas is the hero and which Douglas admired. So he adopts the name Frederick Douglass. He and Anna soon realized that there isn't going to be an easy way of making their way in the world in Manhattan, New York. Manhattan, New York was a pretty racist and tough place for blacks to be. We think of the city today as very liberal and progressive, but in the question of slavery, the New York City was pretty backward. You might remember that right after shortly after Battle of Gettysburg, where Lincoln makes a final push to bolster the army to deal the final defeat to the South, there are draft riots in New York. And those draft riots were essentially race riots of whites against black, of where black people were run down on the streets and killed, and black houses and businesses were burned. Anyway, that's New York City. So Douglass, who from his work in the shipyards in Maryland, knows is a skilled worker. He's a caulker on fixing ships. So the abolitionist network that he taps into tells him, look, there's a lot of work in New Bedford, which is a major whaling port in New England, in Massachusetts. And Douglass sets out to New Bedford with Anna. There is indeed a lot of work there, but he can't find work as a caulker, as his skilled trade is. Whites will not accept a peer. White caulkers would not accept a peer. So he takes a lesser job in the docks in New Bedford. And even though he is not doing the job he can do because he's been excluded by race, it's an amazing, there's an amazing passage in which Douglass talks about that first time that he got paid for his work. The first time that he actually has a job where he gets to keep the money, and the kind of empowering, liberating, transformative. It's one of those places I talked about last class, how he has a series of new births, and he talks about that experience as a new birth, the capacity, the ability to generate income, to the ability to earn through your labor, your own money. Douglass in New Bedford begins to get to read The Liberator. And let me say a word here. And I hope you don't mind that I'm giving you so much context about Douglass's life. The idea is that, my hope is that all of this context is going to help you read the speech better and teach the speech better. That's my contribution to your teaching, since you know more about teaching than I do. Douglass starts reading The Liberator. The Liberator is a publication by William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the Massachusetts and then the American Anti-Slavery Society, is the single individual most important in the takeoff of the abolitionist movement in the 30s and 40s, eventually leading the 50s and leading to the Civil War. Abolition had always been in the North American colonies and in the United States. There were always small abolitionist societies. There was always a minority of usually religious minorities, the Quakers notably, that sustained an abolitionist movement, but it was politically insignificant. It is William Lloyd Garrison that put abolitionists in the map, that sparks a religious revival. He's a minister around abolition. William Lloyd Garrison is just an extraordinary, forceful, eloquent, powerful speaker and a brilliant organizer, activist. He builds this organization that, as I said, puts abolitionism back on the map. The main instrument of outlet of communication of this organization is this newspaper called The Liberator. The Liberator has a huge Black reading audience. And Douglass in New Bedford runs across The Liberator, subscribes to The Liberator, and begins reading The Liberator. And he says that reading The Liberator was like hearing a prophet speak. It was reading William Lloyd Garrison express in fiery, compelling, extraordinary rhetoric the ideas and sentiments that Douglass held, but did not have the language to articulate. So he becomes like a hero worshiper, almost, of William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison becomes this towering, heroic figure for Douglass. And as it happens, while Douglass is in New Bedford, there's going to be a big abolitionist meeting presided by William Lloyd Garrison in Nantucket. And Douglas is not going to miss it. So Douglas gets a ticket and gets on a boat along with many other abolitionists to go to this abolitionist rally in Nantucket, in which William Lloyd Garrison is going to be the star figure. It's organized by Garrison and his organization. On the ship, on the boat to Nantucket Island, there's a racist incident where Douglas is not allowed to sit with, I think he bought something like a first class ticket. I forget what the designations were, but he has a ticket that the captain of the ship does not want a black person holding that ticket and sitting with the whites. And Douglas confronts the ship captain over that, has a confrontation with him, in a verbal confrontation. Now, this is a ship full of abolitionists. It's headed to Nantucket to an abolitionist conference. So as you might imagine, the ship captain is not in a good position here, and Douglas becomes a kind of hero on the ship. People soon realize that this black man that has stood up to the captain is a fugitive slave, is somebody who actually lived under slavery. So when they get to the conference, somehow it comes to the attention of Garrison that in the audience there is this fugitive slave. So in the middle of one of his presentations, Garrison calls Douglas out and says, "Hey, I hear that you've got a story to tell. Why don't you come up here and tell us the story?" Douglas says that he has never been more nervous in his life, and that of all the speeches he gave in his life, that's the one speech where he has no idea what he said. He has no memory of what he said at that speech. But Douglas gets there and says, something about his life. And it has an electrifying impact on Garrison. And many eyewitnesses and followers of Garrison say that they never heard Garrison speak with so much holy fire, with so much power as he does after hearing Douglas. And Garrison, being the tremendous organizer that he is, does not lose the opportunity and immediately offers Douglas a job as a speaker, going around as an agent of the Massachusetts Abolitionist Society, doing the lecture circuit that they had, a well-worn lecture circuit that they had. And they hired Douglas to go around and tell his story. So Douglas overnight is transformed from the shipyard worker in New Bedford to a speaker for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. So Douglas goes around, and what he does is tell his story. And the story that he tells is the story that we get written down in Narrative of the Life of an American Slave, from which I read to you last week. It's his first narrative in 1845. It's a straightforward, plain, hard-hitting, simple telling of his life as a slave up to the time of his escape. The very speech that he made over and over again as an agent of the Garrisonian Anti-Slavery Society. As Douglas goes around making this speech, people begin to doubt his authenticity. People say, this guy is too polished, this guy is too articulate, too intelligent, too well-informed to actually have been a slave. This guy is clearly a well-tutored imposter. And in response to that, Douglas writes, after a couple of years on the circuit, maybe 2 years, in response to that, Douglas writes the narrative of the life of an American slave, a narrative that names names and gives places. The narrative says, this is where I was born, was my owner, these are the people around, and he discloses all of the verifying information that demonstrates that his story is accurate. But the moment Douglas does that, he is a target for recapturing. His owners know where he is, what he does, and how to find him. So Douglas puts his life at tremendous peril by publishing the narrative and disclosing the means by which he could be found. So the moment that the narrative comes out, Douglas leaves the country, flees to England, where he spent almost 2 years. Flee may not be the right word. He never, although while he's there, he really considers staying there. But that was not the object that he left there. But he ran off. He spends almost 2 years in England lecturing and making contacts with the English abolitionist and radical network. Douglas is a sensation, and Douglas is shocked by what he experiences in England, which is his first experience of social equality. And this is something that, it's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around, but even in the North, Douglas, there's a lot of racism. In fact, Douglas, one of the very astute points Douglas makes is that there is more racism in the North than in the South. The reason is that in the North, white people do not interact with Black people. There is profound segregation in the North, so that most white people have never had any kind of contact with Blacks, whereas in the South, there is constant contact between Blacks and whites. So even though the whites are slave owners and support the system of slavery, they're actually less racist. They actually understand and recognize the humanity of Blacks in a way that whites in the North don't. It's hard for us to imagine what it is to have a whole lifetime in which you never experience being treated by others as an equal. And that's what Douglas has experienced in his whole life in the United States. When he gets to England, it's the first time that he knows what that feels like, that he has the kind of lived experience, and that gets manifested in 1,000 little gestures and kind of micro messages that just kind of create an atmosphere, and it can't be faked. And in England, he is just taken to be a Black abolitionist. And in America, he could never be seen that way, even among his white abolitionist colleagues. So it's a kind of a revelation for Douglas. And that becomes, for Douglas, the goal of America. That is, Douglas comes back wanting not just to abolish slavery, but to bring about a state of social equality, which he understands very clearly. Eliminating slavery is only the first part of it, it's only the beginning of. Just gonna speed up a little bit so that we can get to the speech. When Douglas returns to America, well, one incident happens in England that's notable. While he's in England, a bunch of his friends take up a collection and open a correspondence with Hugh Auld, who was the legal owner of Douglas, and provide the money to buy his freedom, to buy himself from Hugh Auld. And there's a fascinating correspondence between Douglas and Auld. And throughout his life, Douglas at several points wrote public letters to his former master, his former owner. Douglas gets into a conflict with Garrison and the Garrisonian abolitionists over this question, because Garrison, who is a radical, does not accept the legality of slavery. And to enter into a transaction in which you buy a slave, even if to free him or her, you legitimize and accept the legality of slavery. So the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society did not condone any recognition of the legitimacy of slavery, including this form of recognition of like buying a slave, even if to free him. So Douglas, who has this principle as a Garrisonian abolitionist, has to kind of compromise that principle. And this is where you see one of the places you see his pragmatism come in. He says, look, I understand that position. I agree with the principle. There is a pragmatic situation here that calls for a limited action that is against that principle, but whose expediency outweighs keeping that principle to the letter. So he agrees, he's bought his freedom, but that brings this conflict with Garrisonians, and there is a rift that begins to open while in England between him and his Garrisonian mentors. Another aspect of that rift is that Douglass conceives of the idea and is encouraged and persuaded by his friends, and some money is raised for this by his friends in England, to come to America and start his own newspaper. The feeling that Douglass could do it, that he had the capacity to sustain a newspaper, edit a newspaper, write much of it, but also use it as a voice for Black abolitionists, that it was important to have a paper that was run and owned by a Black abolitionist as an instrument in the abolitionist cause. Of course, this newspaper was going to be a competitor to William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. So William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians are against it. They don't want Douglass to strike off on his own and start his own newspaper. So that causes another rift with the Garrisonians. Douglass decides not to live in Boston or in Massachusetts, and moves to Rochester, New York, where he starts his newspaper, the North Star. One more significant development in Douglass's life that gets us to the 1852 speech on what to the slave is the 4th of July. Douglass is a Garrisonian abolitionist. And as I said, the Garrisonians do not believe in the legality of slavery. And as I said, the Garrison is a radical. One of the ways in which Garrison is a radical is that he is a pacifist. He does not believe in the use of violence of any sort. Also, Garrison rejects the legitimacy of the American Union. In fact, the masthead of the Liberator read, "No union with slaveholders." No union with slaveholders. He wants the union to be dissolved immediately. Not just that, he does not recognize the legitimacy of the union. He wants Massachusetts to withdraw from the union because union with slavery is agreement and support of slavery. He sees the North as morally implicated and responsible for slavery, and wants the immediate dissolution of a union with slaveholders. The Constitution, which establishes this union, is therefore A, illegitimate, and B, Garrison called it, mincing no words, a pact with Satan and a covenant with hell. The Constitution is a pact with Satan and a covenant with hell. In the 50s, in the early 50s, several times William Lloyd Garrison burned the Constitution on stage in a rally, saying, "So perish all compromise with tyranny," as he did it. Douglass preached, this is the abolitionism, the brand of abolition that Douglass preaches, an abolitionism that sees the Constitution as a tainted slaveholding charter, and therefore an illegitimate charter. But there is another reading of the Constitution. And when Douglass moves to Rochester, he moves to the hotbed of what we call political abolitionism, as opposed to Garrisonian abolitionism. And political abolitionism was a brand of abolitionism that wanted to work through the existing political channels to change slavery. So, elect anti-slavery local representatives, state representatives, national representatives. And of course, this would evolve into the Republican Party. That is, the Republican Party is not an abolitionist party, but it believes in using the system to stop the spread of slavery. So these are political abolitionists. Among political abolitionists, there is a reading of the Constitution that is contrary to Garrison's reading. There's a reading of the Constitution that says, look, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. It is a document that upholds freedom and equality. And while it is true that it makes certain compromises and obfuscations to make the union possible, the document itself is anti-slavery, and on the basis of the document itself, we can overturn slavery. One of the things that they would point to is the fact that the Constitution does not use the word slavery. Slavery is never acknowledged as that it exists, or that it can exist in the United States in the Constitution. And when accommodations like the 3/5 clause are made, they are done in such convoluted language as to avoid very awkwardly the legal legitimation of the institution of slavery. So while in Rochester, Douglass has another one of the moments that he calls a rebirth, which is he starts debating these political abolitionists, and over time they kind of wear him down. And Douglass begins to question his position, which, by the way, his position on the Constitution is also the position of the South. The South also believes with Garrisonians that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, that it establishes and guarantees slavery. And Douglass says, I began to grow tired of arguing the Southerner case in this debate, and undertakes a deep study of legal interpretation. It's like he goes to law school on his own. He just begins to read about the history of legal interpretation and has a kind of conversion and changes his mind and announces it in his newspaper that he has changed his mind about the Constitution and that he has come to see that the Constitution is an anti-slavery instrument, and that from here on, the North Star, his newspaper, and his abolition will argue the case that slavery should end on constitutional grounds and therefore get involved in electoral politics. This causes a final and bitter and ugly rift with the Garrisonians. And you can look at that history, but it is at the moment when this rift, bitter, acrimonious, and public rift is happening with his former white mentors, the Garrisonians, that Douglass is invited by the Rochester Women's Anti-Slavery Association to give a speech on the 4th of July of 1852. Douglass insists that the speech be given on July 5th rather than on July 4th, for reasons that are obvious to you when you read the speech, but that was the traditional mode of Black abolitionists. Black abolitionists would hold big meetings and celebrations on July 5th, and not on July the 4th. I'm about to kind of begin to talk about the speech. Before I do that, I want to pause and invite questions, reflections, comments on anything that I've said or on some issue that maybe I did not talk about, but that you want to put in front of the group. Please.
So Hani just put a question in the chat.
Okay, I'm not.
That's okay.
Yeah, I have a kind of a one-track mind, so it's
I think there's this question around particularly what you literally just said in the last 10 seconds about arguing the end of slavery on constitutional grounds versus disposing of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, where that conversation fits into the mission of the 1619 Project. And we could spend probably 4 hours on that. So, if you want to comment on that, or we can sort of wait till later.
I'll comment on that because it's the 1690 Project is a great text to use as a kind of counter narrative to the dominant presentation of slavery in the United States, in United States history, a changing dominance, I should say. I often ask students, and sometimes I give this as an assignment when I teach the Constitution, before I teach it, when I assign it, kind of whatever the class before we're going to talk about the Constitution, sometimes I ask students to read the Constitution precisely for this question, precisely to come away with an opinion on whether the Constitution supports slavery, whether slavery is an anomaly that actually cuts against the Constitution. The fact of the matter is that you can argue it both ways. You can argue it well both ways. And Douglas made brilliant arguments on both sides of the question when he held the one, and then later when he held the other. In a way, the 1690 Project raises a related set of questions, which is, to what extent is the United States in its DNA a racist political project and a racist, therefore a racist society, where despite the efforts and successes of anti-racist activists, we face a kind of fundamental reality of what the U.S. national project was conceived as and meant to be. There's another reading that, or there's another side to that question, which is, again, at the heart of the 1619 Project, of whether slavery is an anomaly, whether slavery is a blot, a compromise to principles that are actually the DNA of America. And people like Lincoln and Douglas, that's the view that they held, that slavery was an anomalous rather than constitutive of the American national project. So that's a great question for today, and that is a question that people will have different experiences on, and I can tell you that if you're an African American growing up in the United States, your experience might very well lend incontrovertible, undeniable evidence to the notion that to the interpretation of America that sees it as a fundamentally, inherently racist country. That is, you can be a Black person who experiences the country that way. So there is a way in which that view is real. There is a way in which that view cannot be argued, refuted through argument, because it is confirmed in experience by many people of color, Black people in America. But anyway, I think that question of the place of racism in the idea of America, sometimes I've heard people say, and I agree with this, that America is both a country and an idea. And the question is whether that idea of America is a racist idea, or whether in fact racism is a deviation, a anomaly from that idea. So that's what I would say right now. Other thoughts or questions, and even if you've written it on the chat, I would love to hear your voice. So I encourage you to question or comments to actually say it.
So one of the things that I noticed while you were talking, and with what Hani brought up, is, and just what you said here about this idea of the inherent racism within the birth of the country. And I think that I found it incredibly ironic that when Douglas was speaking and writing, as would any other person who had been educated in the country, he had to defend his ability to be articulate, right? Even to the abolitionists who saw him as a fraud, which in a sense was inherently racist, to think that this man who grew up as a slave could not possibly be the same man who spoke with such eloquence and gravitas and education. And I find that abhorrent and ironic, and does go back to this notion of even the abolitionists themselves, with that challenge to him, present themselves as inherently racist, that the slave has to take on a particular stereotype that doesn't mesh with what they imagine, what they see with Douglas. And I find that really incredible.
Yeah, that is amazing. And I think it holds a profound lesson for us today, and something that I remember as an undergraduate, when this what should be obvious just kind of became a reality in my mind. I kind of saw it, and it was a very powerful insight. Again, though it's very obvious, but I think it can be missed by a student, the fact that these people were abolitionists, but they were still racist. That is, that you can be against slavery and be a racist. Like, those two things tend to conflate in our minds when we look back, and we just think that, oh, if you are against slavery, it's because you are for racial equality. No, far from it. Most abolitionists, the overwhelming number of white abolitionists, were not for racial equality. Racial equality was a crazy radical idea. And most abolitionists believed that you could not have equality because there was no equality, because blacks and whites were not intellectually and morally equal. I think the profound lesson comes about when we think about what that might mean for us today, because you have a lot of liberals, a lot of even anti-racist activists, people who are genuinely committed to an anti-racist agenda, to an agenda of equality, that have racial prejudice embedded in the way that they see the world. What they call implicit bias. You're not aware, you don't consciously, deliberately hold a racist view. You have simply constructed a way of seeing things that incorporates prejudice. And the profound lesson there is for us to ask ourselves to what extent we hold such racist preconceptions, so such implicit biases, and to never rest in the moral comfort of saying, oh, you have a problem with racism, you have a problem with implicit bias. I am an activist for racial equality. I am cool. I went to the Black Lives Matter march and I'm all good. And the problem is in society. The problem is elsewhere. I think there is a lesson for us to, a lesson of humility, a lesson of approaching our own weaknesses and blindnesses with humbly, being open to that unfolding realization. And I should say, as a person of color, that when I say that, I'm not just talking about white people. Both of us who are of color and not African Americans can often share some of the same prejudices. I think African Americans can also share racial prejudices that are the result of the distortions of American society. Something related to what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness. That is, that the prevailing racist paradigms in our society are internalized by even the victims of racism. So even the victims of racism are not automatically exonerated or freed, liberated from racism, from holding racist, implicit biases, implicit racial biases. Let me jump into the speech a little bit and perhaps look at some passages and hopefully have more discussion in the 35 minutes or so that we have left than we did in the previous near hour. So Douglas is invited to Corinthian Hall. Corinthian Hall was a relatively new hall that had opened in Rochester to host concerts and lectures and such. There is I'm going to share just a picture of it that here it is, a sketch of it, a print of it. There's Corinthian Hall. It's called Corinthian Hall because of these Corinthian columns by the stage. It had these 4 huge chandeliers. It was an elegant, beautiful, fancy event space. Has big, tall windows, so it's really well illuminated in there. And Douglas was very familiar. The hall was just a few blocks away from the offices of the North Star in Rochester. So it's a familiar venue to him. For the occasion of his speech, it's a full house. 600 people or so are at the speech. The way that they plays out is right before Douglas' speech, somebody got up on stage and read the Declaration of Independence out loud. And then without introduction, like ending of the reading of the Declaration of Independence, the person walks off stage, and without introduction, Frederick Douglass walks up to the stage. Every single person in that audience knows who Frederick Douglass is, both because he's a big person in Rochester, and everybody who's there is in some way an abolitionist sympathizer. So they all know who Douglass is. So he is an audience that literally needs no introduction. Douglas's speech comes in three movements, in three parts. And if you teach like rhetoric and oratory, this speech is a great example of a lot of formal rhetorical conventions. So the three parts, the first part of the speech, well, Douglass begins with the classic diminishing of one's ability, the classic kind of deference and recognition of one's limitations and incapacities, right? So begin by putting yourself down. Douglass says, I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. And as part of that little introduction, he also adds the line, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable. Strategic understatement there that has a kind of humor in it. But that first part, after that kind of lowering of expectations, as it were, the first part is in praise of the founding fathers. That's kind of the first movement of this speech. And in that way, it's sort of a traditional 4th of July address, recognizing the achievements and honoring the founding fathers. And that, one thing about that part of the speech, and maybe we'll look at it, is that Douglass really knows his history. One of the things that part of the speech demonstrates is that Douglass is a close and astute reader and student of the history of the revolution. If you read that speech, there's a lot of very nuanced understanding that gets shown there. That if you know the history of the revolution, you will know that Douglass knows it as well. From this speech, Douglass is a voracious student. Then you get to the second movement, the biggest kind of the body, the brunt of the speech is this longer second movement, which is a condemnation of slavery in no uncertain or ambiguous terms. It is just a spellbinding and masterful rhetorical performance. Douglass, is one of the great speakers in American history, a country that has produced some pretty good speakers. Douglass stands up there among the greatest. Somebody described the experience of hearing Douglass speak as a tornado in a forest. A tornado in a forest. You can see that. You can see the force, the sweeping, irresistible force of Douglass's rhetoric as he in that second movement, he touches on particular places. One is touches about the internal slave trade, the existence the ongoing outrageous existence of slave trade. You can go to any southern city, including the nation's capital, and go to the slave market and witness this crazy, unspeakably horrible scene. So it talks about the internal slave trade, talks about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a law passed in 1850 in the wake of the Mexican-American War that committed the federal government and local law enforcement to the capture and return of slavery, of fugitives, and without giving the fugitive a chance to mount a defense, to challenge the legality of the rendition. So part of that second movement, internal slave trade, Fugitive Slave Act, religious liberty, the way in which the Fugitive Slave Act and slavery itself is a violation of religious liberty. The role, another section on the role of the church and of American Christianity, a fierce condemnation of the way in which the church, and this is important, Douglas makes the point, the church is not neutral. The church actually takes sides with the oppressor. And Douglas says, yes, of course, there are exceptions, but without the support, the theological support of the church, slavery would crumble in a day, Douglas says. Somebody brought up the other day the kind of slogan that is floating around, that silence is violence. And I've seen white silence is violence around as well. And it's that's not what Douglas is calling out the church. It's not merely calling out the church for silence. It's calling out the church for positive support of slavery. Maybe I'll come back to that slogan about silence is violence. There's a lot to be said about the way, well, I'll just say this. There are two things. One is the ways in which non-action before a situation of injustice can amount to support of the situation. That is, that a neutral position, in fact, supports the status quo. So neutrality before injustice, for clear injustice, is tantamount to support for injustice. That's one thing to be said about that slogan. The other thing to be said about that slogan is that it can be used as a way to, as a kind of tool for moral coercion, as a kind of tool for coercing people who have not had a change of heart or an insight into themselves, into either actual silence or uncritical support of this or that specific form of activism. So that's the second and longest movement, the movement of condemnation and denunciation of slavery. And then the third movement, which is one that when I teach this speech, I like to spend some time on, is the third movement is support of the Constitution. It is the movement in which it gives us hope, in which he says, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. And the kind of call to action, and the call to action is about the Constitution. The call to action is about exercising citizenship. It's about using the tools of citizenship, the status of citizenship, the meaning of American citizenship as an anti-slavery tool. I think I mentioned last class the notion that the notion of a citizen interpreter emerges here. The notion that part of American citizenship involves debating the meaning of the Constitution with a view of bringing our political instantiation of the Constitution closer to the ideals that animate it, ideals that Douglas takes to be present in their purest form, not in the Constitution, but in the Declaration of Independence, which he quotes several times in this speech, the Declaration of Independence. So that is the fourth movement of the speech. Let me pause there again and invite questions, comments, or passages. There are some passages that I would be curious to read together, but I would also be curious to read together passages that struck you or that you might want to bring up. But let me open the forum for questions or comments, passages for us to look at together.
Roosevelt, just quickly, I don't want to harp on 1619 or anything like that.
Okay.
But in reading the first movement, I find it hard to, they see the premises of the 1619 Project and Douglas's first movement seem to be in stark opposition. Is that not the case, or are there
I think
that?
Yeah, I think it is the case. And Douglas's first movement is Douglas's movement was celebratory and in keeping with the spirit of the 4th of July. And I think part of what Douglas is doing is putting his audience at ease and saying, look, I get it. I get what's special about America. I get what's special about yesterday. I get what's special about your celebration of that generation of men. And that's it. That's what that accomplishes. Douglas does not dwell on, in fact, the one invocation about George Washington is that George Washington liberated his slaves with his will. Douglas does not dwell on how implicated the founding fathers are in the system of slavery. And it's not because he doesn't know that they are, it's not because he doesn't talk about it in other places. It's that's not the occasion. That's not what he's doing in this occasion. He's got other fish to fry at that occasion. But I think Douglas is keenly and subtly aware of the contradictions that the founding generations and the founding fathers lived with. Jefferson's simultaneous ownership of slavery, and as we now know, his support of slavery, ownership of slavery, and his simultaneous romantic liaison with the slave, and his will and impulse to end slavery, unwillingness to put his own welfare and wealth on the line behind that idea.
The one mention of the founder specifically, I think it's of a founder, I think is interesting, is Washington, as you pointed out. And his quote is interesting because he says, and I don't know where he's quoting from, if this is the Bible. He says, the evil that men do live after them. The good is often turned with their bones. So he's actually, that's a pretty poignant critique, even though it's a praise of Washington. He's also saying the evil of Washington lives after him. The good he did is interred with his bones. But he's still using the founders he's elevating them and using as a kind of hammer to slam the current generation
that's right.
Hypocrisy and the like. So
that's right. And that is the, I think you're correct in pointing out that is the exact opposite take on the founders of the 1619 Project. I think it's a rhetorical choice. I actually think that Douglas would recognize much of what the 1619 Project establishes, and himself would point it out. But this is not that occasion for him. Yeah. And I know I interrupted someone. I want to come back to it. I think Douglas understands that people are complicated, and the ways in which the founders are complicit with slavery does not diminish or delegitimize the things that he does say about them, their bravery, their heroism, their wisdom, their largeness, as he says. They were great men, he says in no uncertain terms. There was somebody who was going to, yeah.
I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. Is there anyone who hasn't had a moment to share that has a passage that spoke to them, that maybe has been a little bit more quiet? I'd love to bring everyone's voice into space. And if you prefer to write it in the chat, we can do that. But we, as Roosevelt said, we want to hear everyone's voice. So feel free to unmute yourself.
I just want to say, like, that it's on page 41, that even though Douglas starts by giving praise to the founders, he says, and instead of being the honest men I have before declared them to be, they were the veriest impostors that ever practiced on mankind. So he refutes himself later on once he's...
This is page 41.
It's page 35 of his document. Okay. It's page 41 of the booklet that we have
okay.
that has his speech in it.
Mm-hmm. And the passage you read is?
It's about halfway down the page after a quote that starts with "to palter with us."
Mm-hmm. And it says, and instead of being the honest men I have before declared them to be, they were the veriest impostors that ever practiced on mankind. This is the inevitable conclusion, and from it there is no escape. But I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution of the United States. It is a slander to the memory, at least so I believe. So this is that position is the position that he has come away from. That is that he wants to say that the founders were not merely imposters. He wants to say that the founders, even though they could not bring about the implementation, set up a system that was going to squeeze slavery out of the Union. So yeah.
I think too, I agree with what you're saying there, Dr. Montás, that's after the semicolon is where he separates himself. If I go back to the very beginning of page 4, I don't know what page it is, let's see. 4 of Douglas, 10 of the booklet. He's very clear of talking about, that use of your. This is your birthday. This is for you. This is your deliverance, your national life. And I think maybe what he's trying to do is cut the founders a break of saying they were honest in dealing with you, white people. Yeah. For us, not so much. He's trying to, obviously he has created this of where they faltered and who they did not see as part of that. Can I, the passage that I think that fits here with our group, it's 3536 of the booklet, 2930 of Douglas, and he's talking about religion and the role of religion. And he quotes from Isaiah.
I'm sorry, 2526 of the booklet?
3536 of the booklet.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's quoting from Isaiah, who just kind of ripped through our East Coast, about the language that's here. I found interesting because of the way it gets echoed in Lincoln's second inaugural in 1963. Oh, there's my phone. Yeah, 18. Oh, I'm off. I am a historian. Just not very good at it all the time. But he brings up this really interesting passage that it might be better for people more familiar with the Bible than I to take apart. Mm-hmm. In which he and in Lincoln's speech, he uses this to say that God's wrath is there to punish the nation. That the Civil War was brought by God to punish those who brought slavery. and that they had to live with it, that their hands were full of blood, and
right,
that they would be
punish
judged.
both North and South.
To punish both the North and South for the
right.
scourge of slavery,
Yeah.
Which was a fascinating omission. I was just surprised to see it here in being used more directly in Douglas.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Lincoln and Douglas had a really interesting and rich relationship. I'm actually going to teach a class in the spring, a seminar on Lincoln and Douglas, getting into this. But actually, his assessment of Lincoln reminds me very much of his assessment. It's in the same vein of his assessment of the founding fathers, because he sees Lincoln in his complexity. He sees Lincoln, and he begins his speech by saying Lincoln was a white man's president, and he represented the interests of the white man and governed for the white man. And as the speech goes on, he gives Lincoln tremendous credit for his growth and he says that he calls him the great liberator. He ends up by giving him full credit for emancipation. So I think, the most comprehensive assessment of Lincoln as a figure in American history comes from Douglas's speech in, I want to say something like 1872 or something like that, but it's a speech at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial. There's a memorial to Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation in DC that includes a statue of Lincoln and of a kneeling slave.
Yes, standing soldiers, kneeling slaves.
Yeah.
It's a great book on memorials. I'll put that up there.
So that memorial, which it's problematic in its, and Douglas points it out, the representation. But at the dedication of that memorial, Douglas gives what I take to be the most comprehensive assessment of Lincoln as a figure in American history that there is. So I can't recommend that speech enough if you are interested in the relationship between Lincoln and Douglas. Let's look at what is perhaps the most famous passage in this speech. It's on page 26 of the booklet, page 20 of the Douglas text. So beginning at the top of the page is 2 paragraphs here. Again, the most famous portion of the speech, the most quoted portion of the speech. So at the top of page 26 of the booklet, page 20 of the Douglas text, I'm going to read those 2 paragraphs that take up most of the page. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability, and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of this United States at this very hour. One of the things that you kind of, reminds you of the power of words. It reminds you how words can stir and move and transform. There's probably no new information to us here, at least. Like, we know all of this that Douglas is saying. But the impact it has on us, the way the cumulative impact of this set of images and concepts and rhythms of speech, it's so powerful. It to me is an example that reminds me that rhetoric, that oratory, is so important and so powerful. You don't just need the facts. You don't just need the information. There's another dimension of performance, articulation, communication that is absolutely necessary, and which absolutely adds a dimension of significance way beyond the mere information. Anything about that passage anybody wants to comment on? There are a couple of things there that might be worth just highlighting. Anyone want to highlight anything that stands out to you in that passage?
I feel like I'm speaking a lot.
So I was just going to say, yesterday I know Cam mentioned that when she read this, she saw a sense of a call for radical action. And I'm thinking a lot about this idea of we need to be quickened. And your email from the student. And I use language often that we're playing a long game, that civic education is a long game. And yet the spring was, no, there is no time to wait. There is no time to go slowly with change and the pursuit of justice. To the contrary, the pursuit of justice has to be quickened. So these are some concepts that I'm struggling with when it comes to students, because a student is eager and wants change now.
Yeah.
And how do we balance that tension?
Yeah. I think Douglas gives us a good way to think about that. When he says the feeling of the nation must be quickened, as you pointed out, the conscience roused, the propriety or the sense of shame of the nation startled, the hypocrisy of the nation exposed. He is talking there, this is all about changing the feeling of the nation. It's all about somehow touching the conscience, the sense of shame, the sense of justice, the heart of the nation. And I think the most effective activists and organizers have always understood this. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and even Greta Thunberg and all very successful organizers have to understand that what you want to do is transform, not defeat your opponent. That is, that what you have to do is stir, arouse the feeling, the sentiment of the public. So, today I think it's important for us to ask ourselves in our activism, or even young people that might come to us as they might to you, for a sense of, what do I do? What is there to be done? It's an important insight for us to highlight that what we're after is a transformation of the minds and hearts of people. And how do we do that? Sometimes you obviously just have to get their attention, and that might involve some kind of civil disobedience. But it cannot be that can only be effective as a way of, as Douglas says here, startling the attention, of getting the attention. Then what do you do with the attention? What you do with the attention has to be something that's transformative and not merely accusatory, not merely condemnatory, not merely alienating. There's got to be the point, the effectiveness of activism comes from finding ways to enliven, to quicken, to arouse the common humanity of the opponent or of the source of injustice. And Douglas understands that. That's why he, there's this long part of the speech where he just dismisses arguing. He says, what, do you want me to argue that blacks are people? Do you want me to argue that people deserve liberty? Do you want me to argue that slavery is wrong? It's like, no, I'm not going to argue any of those things. That's obvious. What I am going to do is try to give you a sense of the lived experience of a slave in America and a black person on the 4th of July. That's what he's trying to do here. And that's, we won't have time to look at it, but the description of the slave trade, he invokes this imaginary procession of a group of slaves moving from the Potomac, probably DC, the DC slave market, to New Orleans. And he says, look at them walking. There's the old man with gray locks and thinning hair. There's the young woman with a babe at her breast. There's the 13-year-old girl who is crying because she's been separated from her mother. And it's this extraordinary literary picture which is what Harriet Beecher Stowe did so masterfully with Uncle Tom's Cabin, is allow you to experience sympathetically, that is, allow you to empathize with the human experience of the slave. And that is a literary performance that really, when I reread this speech for this class, that really struck me. How what Douglas is doing there it's just a literary exercise. It is using the power of literature, the power of fiction, the power of narrative to move the heart, to transform the consciousness. So anyway, I guess the one sentence response is that I think we should bring our students' attention to the fact that activism is after changing, transforming your target rather than defeating your target. Other thoughts or comments? We just have a few more minutes, but I'd love to have some other reflection. Naomi?
This is kind of just like a funny question maybe, but if you, being an expert as you seem on Frederick Douglass, if you could imagine him being alive today, like what do you think his impression would be of the protests going on, or the state of racial affairs right now?
Or the what?
Of like racial affairs or racial conflict today.
There's a story that it might be apocryphal, I'm not sure, but that late in Douglas's life, Douglas lived a long life. Late in his life, some young activists came to him to ask him for advice. And that he said, his advice was agitate, agitate, agitate. Douglas is an agitator. Douglas is a radical. And he, I think, sees the role and place of activism as really, really central, really fundamental. If you read, so Douglas is right after the Civil War, and right after emancipation, after the Civil War, Douglas reorients his activism away from the abolition of slavery to the question of civil rights and to racism. Like he shifts his target from slavery to racism. And those speeches are really, really powerful and really relevant to today. So, you know, Douglass would be out in the streets. Douglass would be writing newspapers. Douglass would be giving interviews. Douglass would be using I'm sure he would be on social media. Douglass was so media savvy. You know, Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century. Douglass used, and he never smiled. You'd not find one portrait of the, you know, again, more portraits of him than any other American. You're not going to find one where he's smiling. And he used the image in such a powerful way. And the print media, he started a newspaper and edited and wrote for newspapers. Douglass is a masterful user of media. So I am sure that today he would be all over Twitter and Instagram. Who knows? He might even be on Snapchat and TikTok if he were alive today. But he would be out there agitating and fighting. There's no quiet way of doing the work that we need to do.
That is so beautiful, and thank you. Ilana, as always, we could talk for another 10 hours. It is 11:30, so I want to close, and as always, thank you, Roosevelt. I'm gonna share this all around. The wisdom is so beneficial to the whole group. We're gonna come back at 3 today. We have an hour. It's really designed as a workshop. We've heard a lot, we've learned a lot, we've practiced a lot, and we have lots more ahead of us, but this will be workshopping around our classrooms. And does anybody have anything else they want to close, or you could put in the chat or say to Roosevelt?
Oh, please.
And I would say one of the things you've taught me more than anything, Roosevelt, is humility, and I thank you for putting that at the top of all your teaching, the importance of humility.
Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for having me here. I hope to hear more about you and how this cohort proceeds further. Okay, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.